As it unfolded. So the first group focused on the user and the occupiers. So the big society was about handing everything over to the people who owned and used the buildings. And the main purpose of that was to get the best functionality out of the product, out of the asset. So that was where everybody, all the feeling was going. And one view was that we're not getting very good feedback in the process and getting the right information so that we get the product right, so that we get maximum functionality. So that's the first group. The second group took a slightly different approach. The second group took a slightly different approach and looked at the big society and its emphasis on localism and raised the question: how do we get the power of communities without money? And there was an example offered in some of the more federal states where you've got smaller sort of local governments and with greater local authority sort of control or impact, that they have greater control of the revenue and are able to feed that back into the local communities to get the impact where they believe they wanted it. To do that in this country, what the belief was that we had to educate people in the planning process. If we want people to come on board, they need to understand how they engage in the process. So we need the communities to understand the planning process. We need greater consultation. But what was recognised that the planning process or the consultation to improve that process was resource intensive. So whilst engaging the communities, whilst the communities or the people in the community coming forward and sitting and engaging in consultation doesn't cost money, the facilitation, the evaluation and making sure that we actually get the proper feedback back into planning so that we get back to the first stage of getting a usable building that has greater impact on the community was extremely resource intensive. So it's just also making government and the wider wider circle of people how resource intensive proper consultation is. The third group raised the issue of what actually are we talking about? Are we talking about new build? Are we talking about retrofit? And the view was this: we're talking about all buildings, all the things that exist, all that we're going to build. There was then a sort of a question raised of the nature of the occupiers and of the landlords or the people who own the buildings. One from the occupiers, one from their buildings, but the other from when you've got people coming into communities, when you've got large organisations such as Tesco's and Barclays Banks. We already have some processes where there's sort of offset planning, where there are impacts on the local community that are gained by those buildings. And it was thought that in some communities, the likes of the large organisations can thrust their buildings on communities with little valuable impact, and in others there was much greater impact because of the way the community is engaged. So from one Tesco store being put into a community and there being a little impact, there could be much greater impact by using the planning process and using equivalently. There was also raised by a number of groups the not in my backyard syndrome and sort of how do we overcome that? How do we move that forward? There was a need for reskilling generally, reskilling the local community. It was also felt that we actually are as an industry very good at engaging with local communities and engaging with building users, but we're not very good at transferring or disseminating those lessons learned. So one thing that we do need to do to improve this big society picture is to engage properly, but more importantly, make sure the lessons learned from those engagements are transferred out or are there for the future. Group 4 raised, we're really just drawing on the previous groups. We're talking about the importance of linkages between the clients, the developers, governments and local communities. Just raising the questions around time and money is we're always thrusting buildings to be built as quickly as possible, to drive through the design process as fast as possible with minimum money, and that's not always the solution. Obviously with the big society generally, we're looking at volunteers. We need to look at enablers, how we get the greatest potential out of the big society. Controversially, it was considered that the big society is actually little societies. So we're talking about creating small communities with greater power. And again, there was an emphasis on the importance of communication. Finally, things were going fast, so I used the acronym rather than the full term, but it seemed to suggest something else. Suggesting that the big society is an emotive term. It was really considered important that for this to be important, it had some direction. It was also important that there was compromise, and those were considered two really important things that somebody needs to get right on how you actually give something direction, yet make sure that you've got compromise so that you can make things work. There's some behavioural changes that need to develop. There's change versus value, and issues of efficiency versus democracy. Is it Gervais' paradox was considered, where something's put forward for one reason, yet it doesn't actually achieve that? Is that sort of a right summary of that? Sort of where we're driving something for one agenda, yet it doesn't necessarily achieve that, and it was put forward in
the context of
low carbon. Yep.
That is below a lot of the initiatives we've been talking about today can deliver potentially significant reductions in carbon in the building. If what that then does as a consequence of wealth flowing back into society through the savings we make, that then the danger is that then drives the demand for other energy consuming goods and services.
So that was just something that we should be wary of, where we're making savings on the energy use of the building fabric. It may result in greater spends on things that consume energy. And finally, there was something that was suggested that for upskilling the local community in some initiatives such as Be On Site, which was on-site training and education, which naturally engages the local community with the site and gives that an upskills them. So those were just really ideas that were generated out of the big society. Thank you.